Welcome to the Waterton Glacier Science and History Week 2021. Thank you so much for joining us today as we explore recent results of scientific research and conservation efforts in Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. The Peace Park, the first of its kind, was established in 1932. It comprises of Waterton Lakes National Park in Alberta, Canada, and Glacier National Park in Montana, USA. We want to respectfully acknowledge that we are on traditional ancestral homelands of the Siksikaitsitapi, the Kootenay, the Salish, and the Quileespay people, whom we recognize as the original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. We honor with gratitude the people who have cared for this land throughout the generations and continue to maintain enduring connections to their traditional territories. Today is the first day of our 4-day webinar series. Each day, we'll bring you a new presentation highlighting current research and conservation topics related to Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. Every year, researchers conduct scientific and historical studies here in the heart of the crown of the continent, and we are excited to bring you some of their latest findings directly to you, wherever in the world you may be. Today, we are featuring the presentation, More Humans and Bigger Fires, How Are Waterton's Plants Communities Responding?, led by Dr. Jenny McCune, Assistant Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada. Dr. McCune grew up in a farm in Southern Ontario and became fascinated by plants and ecology during her undergraduate degree at the University of Guelph. She studies how plant communities in Canada's southern landscapes are influenced by human disturbance and landscape change. She holds a master's in science and ethnobotany at the University of Kent in England and a PhD in botany from the University of British Columbia. She took up a faculty position at the University of Lethbridge in 2019. This presentation will last about 30 minutes and we'll have about 10 minutes for questions at the end. At any time, you can write your question in the questions box on the screen. If you would like live captioning, watch for the link in the chat box. Thanks again for joining us today. We will now turn the presentation over to Dr. Jenny McCune.
Thanks very much. I'll just wait until I can get my screen going here. If I can. Oh, here we go. So can everyone see this slide here? Hopefully, yeah, it looks like you can. So thanks very much, Samara, and hello everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to be here to present some of the research that my lab and I have been working on for the past couple of years. And I'm speaking to you today from the University of Lethbridge, which is on the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So I just want to acknowledge that and to say that I honor and respect the Blackfoot people and their traditional ways of knowing and caring for this land for many, many generations. Before I get going, whoops, there we go. I want to kind of start with my acknowledgements. So this is a collaborative project between the University of Lethbridge and Parks Canada that wouldn't have happened without many, many people, especially Parks Canada botanist, who's now retired, Peter Acuff, and Parks Canada ecologist, Robert Sissons. And also my graduate student, Jed Lauren, who took this project on for his master's research, and all the field assistants that have helped us over the past couple summers. So we humans tend to take plants for granted. We notice them sometimes, especially when they're blooming, but often we don't register how dynamic they are, how much they're changing over time. We kind of see them as a green background, like a green blur, kind of like when you're driving past a forest in a really fast car. And there's even a name for this phenomenon. We call this plant blindness, this tendency for people to notice animals more than they notice plants. Oops, just trying to There we go. But if we stop and look closely at the plants that grow in the forests and grasslands around us, we see this incredible diversity of plant species. And everyone has unique adaptations and unique life histories that allow them to adapt to their situation. Over time, some of these species are increasing and spreading, and some of them are declining or even disappearing from an area. And Waterton Lakes National Park is a hotspot of plant diversity here in southern Alberta, with on the order of somewhere around 1,000 different vascular plant species growing within its borders. And this incredible diversity of plants is because of the huge elevation range that we have within the park. So within this relatively small area, we have everything from grasslands and foothills, riparian shrublands, up to montane forests, and all the way up into the alpine. And Waterton is also home to some globally rare plant species. This is just one example, the pygmy poppy, which only grows on these high mountain slopes in this tiny little corner of southwestern Alberta and northern Montana, and nowhere else in the entire world. So I would submit that we need to care about and understand how these plant species are responding to different changes on the landscape, just as much as we want to understand how this is impacting things, animals like bears or butterflies or other things like that. So we may not notice these subtle changes that are happening in plant communities over time, but we definitely notice big catastrophic events like the Kenow wildfire that burnt about half of the vegetation in Waterton back in 2017. And this was a massive fire, and most of the areas that burned were severely burned. And so we wonder and we worry, will forests and grasslands return to what they looked like before the fire? Will the plant species that we love and care about that used to grow in these forests return? But in addition to wildfire, there are other changes going on. In fact, there are more gradual changes happening as a result of the lack of fires. So these photos are from the Mountain Legacy Project, which uses re-photographs of historical photos to show how the landscape in the Rocky Mountains has been changing. And as you can see from these pictures, in many parts of southern Alberta in these regions, we can see this infilling of forests into grassland areas and densification of the forest over the past century or so. And so if this forest infilling is ongoing over time, even in the past few decades, it might be favoring species like this rattlesnake plantain orchid over here that loves shady, closed-in forests, and maybe disfavoring species like this paintbrush, which needs open, sunny areas. And of course, one major influence that somehow we tend to forget about is our own influence. We've got many, many more people coming to our national parks to enjoy the outdoors. And of course, human disturbance is a major cause of change in ecosystems around the world, including to the plants. So I've heard people describe exotic plants as, these horrible invaders that outcompete natives and spread across the landscape. But after all, it was us that introduced these species, and it's us that creates these disturbed conditions that really favor these species. And so Waterton is still quite pristine. There are many backcountry areas that humans don't seem to have affected. But even so, could the influx of more and more visitors to Waterton be helping the spread of exotic plants into new areas and maybe changing plant communities as a result? So those are the questions that we're interested in. And luckily, we have a baseline to test this, to measure how plant communities have changed over time since the 1990s. So back in the early 1990s, Parks Canada biologists surveyed over 300 forest plots as part of the Ecological Land Classification Project. Many of these plots were surveyed by Dr. Peter Acuff, this gentleman in the center of the picture there, And we had the pleasure of having Peter come out with us a couple of times as we went out to relocate and resurvey a number of these same plots, so we could see how much has changed. So if we think about the timeline here, going, from the original surveys, which were done in the early 1990s, and then we resurveyed a number of these same sites in 2019 and 2020. So we know that since the 1990s, we had the Kenow wildfire, and many of these plots, but not all of them, were burned. But we also know that in the early 1990s, Waterton would have about on the order of 300,000 visitors per year. By the time of our resurveys, that's pretty much doubled. So now there's about 600,000 visitors per year. And also we have the potential that this trend of forests getting denser and encroaching onto grasslands is still occurring. So here's a map of Waterton, just north of the US border here. And this big purple blob in the center here, that's showing the extent of the fire. And purple means severely burned. So you can see most of the burn area was severely burned. Each of these little points here is one of the plots that was surveyed. Some of them ended up being burned and some of them were not burned. And over 2 summers in 2019 and 2020, Jed and his field assistants relocated and resurveyed 45 of the unburned plots. Those are the ones in blue. And 53 of the burned plots. Those are the ones in red. So they resurveyed 98 plots in total. So what does a plot look like? Well, basically, from a plant ecologist perspective, a plot is just a square of land plopped down, in this case, usually 20 by 20 meters. So we delineate this plot and then we record every single vascular plant species. So we didn't do mosses and lichens, but every single vascular plant growing within that area and how much of the area it covers. So here's a picture looking down on a plot that did not burn in the fire, although as you can see, it has had some fallen trees, probably from a windstorm. And if I superimpose sort of the approximate limits of that plot, Jed and his team are surveying, identifying and writing down every single plant in that plot. And in these plots, we can have anywhere from a few species to over 50 towards 60 sometimes. So in a plot like this, we might have 45 different plant species. But in the burn plots, especially up in the alpine areas, sometimes there were only, as low as 5 or 6 species in that whole 20 by 20 meter area. So this was a tremendous amount of work, using our GPS to navigate back to the original sites, setting up these plots, and identifying and estimating the cover of every single plant. So I wanted to kind of show you what the data looks like. Once we've done all this hard work and we've entered it all into a spreadsheet, this is kind of what it looks like. So here on the side, we have all the plots, and each plot was measured twice, right? Once in the early 90s, labeled as 1994, and once in 2019 or 2020. And then across the top, each column here are all the different species. So I'm only showing you the first 12 or so species. In actual fact, we had over 500 species in total in those 98 plots across the 2 survey periods. So for example, if we look at plot 4055 here, in 1994, it had 26% cover of abilas, which is short form for subalpine fir. In 2019, it had 0 subalpine fir cover. So this is a burned plot that was severely burned in the fire, and as a result, all the subalpine fir died. However, in some plots that weren't burned, there were less drastic changes. So plot 4064 here in 1994 had 35% cover of subalpine fir, and by 2019, pretty similar, just down a bit to 31%. So once we have all this data, we can analyze it to find the major trends over the whole park across all these 98 different plots. So first, let's look at overall numbers of different species. So the overall plant diversity in these 98 plots. In the 1990s, total in all those 98 plots were 403 different plant species. By the time we resurveyed in 2019-2020, there were 426. So an increase in the number of species we found. Now, if we look at the average number of species per plot, in the 90s, that was 26 on average. By 2020, we've gone up to 29 species. So we're increasing the average number of species that we find in these 20 by 20 meter areas. In fact, this was actually higher in the unburned plots. We saw an increase of about 5 species, but of course, many of the burned plots actually lost species, so that balanced out to give only about an increase of 3 species per plot. Now, what about exotic species? Parks Canada is worried about the spread of exotic species throughout the park. In the original surveys, those 98 plots, on average, had less than 1 exotic species. Now we're up to about, on average, 1.5 exotic species per plot, so somewhere between 1 and 2. And in total, in the 90s, there were 13 exotic species in those plots. When JED was out there in 2019 and 2020, they found 33 exotic species total. So that also is an increase. Most of those exotic species were present in the park in the 1990s. They just didn't happen to be present in those 98 plots, and now they've spread to those 98 plots. So 33 exotic species out of the total number that we saw adds up to about 7% of all plant species. And how you look at that depends on kind of your perspective. From my perspective as someone who works in Southern Ontario a lot, on those landscapes, which are highly human dominated, about 25% of the species that we see are exotic. So 7% in Waterton to me seems low, but it all depends on your perspective. So overall, we have more species. We have more species in each plot on average, and we have more exotics. But what we don't know is how the identity of species in each plot has changed over time. So if you imagine, let's say we had 10 species in a plot in the 1990s, and now in 2020, we have 15. So we know we have more species, but we don't know if those are the same species plus 5 more, or if we've had complete turnover, and now we have 15 totally different species. And so we want to try and understand, how much turnover has happened in that period. So one way we can look at that is to look at what I call the stayers. So those are the percentage of species we found in 2020 that were also there in the 1990s. So they've stayed, right? They've stayed consistent between then and now. And so if we look at the percentage of stayers in different types of plots, we see a story of both resilience and change. So even in severely burned plots, only 2 to 3 years after this wildfire, on average, 37% of the plants in those plots were the same plants that were there in the 1990s, well before the fire. So these plants have been able to either survive the fire as underground storage organs or roots, to resprout, or to stay in the seed bank and resprout from seed. But to me, this is pretty amazing that over a third of the plants on average have somehow come through this massive wildfire. In moderately burned plots, the number of stayers was even more. About half of the plants that are there now were there in the 1990s. And in the plots that didn't burn at all, this number was 58%. So in this case, even though we did not see a massive wildfire, we do see quite a lot of turnover, where only 58% of the plants we see today were there in the 1990s. And so it's a mixture of resilience with plants hanging on even through the fire, but also change even in plots that didn't burn. So knowing this, what we want to know is which species and which kinds of species are thriving and which kinds of species are declining over that 30-year time span. And for that, we can use something called an indicator species analysis. Basically, all this is if you imagine these boxes here are 4 different plots that we surveyed. And in the 1990s, 2 of them had a small population of dandelion. Then when we look at the same 4 plots in 2019, 2020, now all of them have dandelion. So dandelion is more frequent and it's more abundant. So we see each plot tends to have a greater population of dandelion. So in this case, there's a significant increase in dandelion frequency and abundance over time. So we consider dandelion to be a winner. In the same way, if we have a species like this little stylized orchid, I'm not sure what species this might be, but in this case, it's much more frequent and abundant in the 1990s than it is in 2019, 2020. So we would call this a loser. It's declined over time. So here I'll introduce you to some of the winners from the burned plots. So in this case, we had about 18 winners. I'm only showing you 5. These include some things you would expect, like fireweed, which as we know is a fire follower. Also disturbance-loving things like lamb's quarters and dandelion, which are both exotic species. And light-loving things like smooth aster and dragonhead. So what we find is winners overall tend to be exotic annual herbaceous plants that like disturbance and don't like shade. So not all of them are exotic, but on average, the winners are more likely to be exotic than the losers. So if we flip that around now and we look at which species have declined over time in the burned plots, we can see a pattern, kind of the reverse of the winners, right? So shade-loving perennial plants like rattlesnake plantain and prince's pine here, sorry, the writing got cut off, were the losers. So they've declined over time in the burned plots. And also woody species like subalpine fir, white bark pine, and Douglas fir, because these things are sensitive to the fire. So the losers in the burned plots tend to be native perennials that are woody, that don't like disturbance, but that do like shade, and usually they have larger seeds. Now, if we switch and look at which plants have increased over time in the unburned plots, we see some trends that we expect. So here is just, again, a sample of 4 of the winners. They include native perennials that love shade, like the rattlesnake plantain here, okay, which is what we would expect if these unburned plots are getting shadier and more forested over time. But also disturbance-loving things like dandelion and timothy, which are both introduced exotics. So here we see that unburned plots are tending to gain taller woody plants. So some of the winners were woody shrubs that are moving in that love shade. And so this kind of points to the fact that even over the past 30 years, we are seeing this continuing sort of infilling of forests. But we also see increasing over time these disturbance-loving and exotic plants. So basically, we're seeing that the unburned plots and the burned plots are kind of going on 2 trajectories. So places that escaped the fire have been continuing to fill in with trees and woody shrubs, and so they're gaining more perennial shade-loving species. Whereas the fire, of course, has set everything back to square one. It's killed most of the canopy, opened it up, let the light come in, and so it's favoring fire followers and disturbance-loving things like fireweed and dragonhead. But whether are burned or unburned, all the plots are gaining exotic species like dandelion here. So what are the take-home messages from all this work? Well, first of all, the greatest change in composition of the plant communities in Waterton has happened in the severely burned sites, which is exactly what we would have predicted. We've surveyed here just 2 or 3 years after the fire. And so there's been major changes from the death of most of the canopy trees, for example. And yet, these plant communities are showing resilience, with on average 37% of the species that were there in the 90s still being there in 2019 and 2020, even after this massive fire went through. Secondly, even in the places that didn't burn, things are still changing, right? So some plant species are moving in and expanding and growing in abundance, and others are dying out. So we can see that this trend of forest infilling that we know has happened since the early 1900s is continuing to happen in the places that didn't burn. And so that's favored these shade-loving species like the rattlesnake plantain orchid. But at the same time, even in unburned areas, exotic species and disturbance-loving native species are increasing. So probably this is showing the impact of this increased visitorship, this increased presence of humans on the landscape. And finally, even in places that only burned moderately, if they are near trails or roads, they tended to have greater shifts in the change in plant composition compared to places that are far away from roads and trails. And so the plant communities in these burned sites that are close to human disturbance may actually not return to precisely the exact composition they had before the fire. They may be going on a slightly different trajectory because of the influence of human recreation. So these are probably the places we should keep our eye on the most as we track sort of whether or not these plant communities are going back towards what they were before the fire. So like so many stories in ecology, when we ask, what are the factors that are influencing these plant species that we care about, the answer is all of these things have an impact. So the Kenow wildfire, which as I said, has set things back to sort of early stages in succession. Human disturbance, definitely with an increase in human visitorship, but also this continuing gradual trend in the unburned sites of forest infilling and densification. And more importantly, we can see interactions between some of these things. So we can see interactions between the Kenow wildfire and human disturbance in the burned plots that are close to areas that humans access, like roads and trails. And so if we're going to predict what's going to happen with plant species and plant communities in Waterton, we have to consider all these factors going into the future. So that's all I wanted to say. I want to thank you all very much for coming. I'm happy to take questions now and clarify anything that was confusing. And if you want to get in touch with me, I've put my email, my website, and even my Twitter handle down at the bottom here. So thanks very much. And I'll try and switch my screen back if I can.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Jenny. We'll now be answering some of the questions posted throughout the presentation. You're welcome to continue posting questions and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So our first question comes from Allie. It regards the Cedar Walking Glacier. So over the past almost 30 years, I've noticed a big change in this small boardwalk hike. It seems super dry now and not lush like it was almost 40 years ago. Before, there were lots of large devil's paw plants and ferns, and in the last 2 years, I've noticed almost none. Are changes like these due to less water being studied too?
That's a great question. Yeah, and so some things that we're working on as we continue to analyze these data are looking at other drivers. And so you're exactly right. Climatic drivers like drought and increased temperature probably also are affecting these plants. And so if you have plant species that are reliant on a certain amount of water and they experience a number of years of drought, absolutely that could be the cause of the changes that you're seeing. So one thing particular that we're interested in is, are we seeing a shift of species kind of up the mountainside as things get warmer? And the one interesting thing about dandelion, for example, is what we see is that dandelion is not only showing up in more plots, but it's showing up at higher elevations than it did in the 1990s. Now, the difficulty is that because of the temperature, or is that just because of the ongoing spread of this species kind of facilitated by trails? But yeah, you're right, absolutely. Droughts and other climatic things are definitely important.
Great, thank you. So the next question comes from Ian. Is there any earlier plant surveys that predate the mountain pine beetle that greatly reduced forest cover by killing most lodgepole pine? Many sites would have been on a reforestation trajectory due to pine elimination.
Yeah, so I've talked with Chris Stockdale. I think he's at NRCan, Natural Resources Canada. They have some forest plots that predate the pine beetle, I believe, but it's only tree surveys, if I believe. So they didn't look at the understory species like the herbaceous and the shrubs. But I would love to know if there are some detailed understory surveys that we could look at. So for them, they can definitely look at the density of trees, how many trees have died, how the kind of canopy composition has changed. But to look at the little herbaceous plants growing in the understory, we need things like the ELC surveys that looked at every single species, not just the trees.
Wonderful, thank you. So our next question comes from Terry. Were the sites with the most stayers in heavily burned areas in the early successional stages before the fire?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I don't know the answer. I'd have to dig deeper into the data. So for example, we could look at, because 37% is the average, right? So there were some burn sites that had a lot fewer stayers, where maybe they even lost all the species that were there in the 90s, and we have some with greater. And so that's a great question to test, would be, can we predict that based on, you know, vegetation type? So were the grasslands able to survive better? You might predict that. Or like you're saying, maybe the successional stage that they were at in the 1990s. There were some sites that Jed told me about where they could tell, you know, there's more woody stuff in here than there was back in the 1990s. But then some of them, you know, it was a forest then and it was a forest now. So kind of pinpointing precisely what successional stage we're at might be tricky. But I agree, that would be a really interesting analysis to try and tease apart, you know, what facilitates that greater resilience where more stayers are able to stay.
Wonderful, thank you. So this next question comes from Dan. Any attempts to decouple historical plant succession patterns from global warming and increased human disturbance? Has a similar study of fauna taken place?
Ooh, that's a great question. I know that there are many studies looking at responses of, for example, birds to climate change over time. So there's one that I use in my courses a lot in the mountains of, I think it was Costa Rica, and they can show how the elevational ranges of these bird species have shifted to an extent that the one that used to be the alpine range bird now is extinct, because basically its preferred temperature no longer exists, right? There's no mountain left. And I don't know if researchers in Alberta have looked at this. I imagine they have, because it's a very popular area. But like I was saying, it is hard to tease apart. You know, we have the three things I talked about, you know, sort of lack of fire leading to forest infilling, increased recreation, and the big wildfire. And we also have changes in the climate. So we have some great climate data from Stefan Kienzl, who's in geography here, who's built models on quite a high resolution for how the climate has changed in Waterton. And so we hope to see if we can link that with the changes that we've seen in the plant communities and do exactly that, try and tease apart, which of these drivers is having the greatest influence.
Wonderful. So our next question comes from Anne. Do you know what is driving the trend of infilling that has been observed in the forests?
So the general hypothesis is that it's a lack of disturbance, primarily fire. So that there's a bit of a debate about how often there would have been fires in this area in the past. Some people say the fire return intervals would have been about every 100 years. But others say they would have been maybe even shorter than that. So we would have had a fire every 30 to 60 years. So if we don't have a fire and if there's enough moisture, that allows woody things to move in. There's also some question about whether the density of grazers, so the density of herbivores that would eat young trees and prevent them from filling in forests and encroaching into grasslands. Maybe the populations of those grazers has declined for different reasons, possibly relating to humans. So I think the main hypothesized reason is lack of that fire disturbance knocking everything back. And if there's enough moisture, then we see just sort of naturally this influx of trees.
Okay, great. Our next question comes from Lauren. I've noticed increased horse activity on the Acamina Parkway, more than I have ever seen, and I drive this road every day. Isn't that a huge contributor to non-native species?
Yeah, I believe it is, and definitely. So talking to Peter Acuff, we'll be on a trail and he'll be like, never see so much Timothy as when I'm on a trail, like a horse riding trail. The question is, how far are those introduced species able to expand in from the trail? So can they only take advantage of those disturbed bright areas adjacent to the trail, or can they actually infiltrate into the forest or the native grassland? But yes, I would say the different types of trails can have different impacts, and that's one thing we're working on actually in the Castle Provincial Park, which is just north of Waterton. We've been surveying transects leading out from a number of trails of different kinds, right? So we have ATV trails, we have hiking trails, we have roads, and then horse trails, and trying to figure out, do those different types of trails have different impacts? But yeah, I would say from what I know, horse trails can bring in a lot of agronomic weeds just from the hay that they eat and the seeds showing up in the horse dung, for sure.
So our next question comes from Ruth. My understanding of the propagation of lodgepole pine is that the cone needs heat, like a fire, to open the cones and release the seeds. Is this true? And if so, have you seen any seedlings?
Yes, we've seen lots of seedlings, and yes, that is true. And so one of the things we looked at was we wish that we actually counted tree seedlings. We didn't, but we do know that if we had lodgepole pine, we tracked the different height categories. So if we had lodgepole pine under 50 centimeters, we know that we had seedlings there. And what we found is that we're more likely to find lodgepole pine seedlings where the fire went through than in other places. So we definitely foresee that these severely burned places, yes, they already have lots of little pine seedlings coming up. And, like I said to Jed, my student, if I had a student come back in 10 years maybe and resurvey, they're going to probably have a heck of a time getting around, because there's going to be these dense thickets of little baby pine saplings that are coming up.
Great, so our next question comes from Rachel. So we've noticed a marked lack of tree regeneration at high elevation after fires in previously forested areas of the last 25 years. We are most familiar with Glacier in the Whitefish Range, but have also seen this in the Bog Marshall Wilderness. Is this being studied in a landscape scale or other?
Yeah, I think there's great interest in this, because one of the things with climate change is that we would expect the sort of the forest ecoregions, right, the montane forest might shift upwards, right? If it's based purely on temperatures, and temperatures are increasing at higher elevations. But like you're saying, if those seedlings are not able to establish at higher elevations for reasons other than temperature, like herbivory, for example, or the substrate isn't right, or soil pathogens, things like that, then that shift that we expect to happen is not going to happen. So when we were looking at the presence of pine seedlings, I'd have to check our data, but I believe they were actually less common at higher elevations, as you might expect. And so, yes, we aren't studying this specifically, but there is a lot of interest in whether that tree regeneration, so will the fire actually facilitate the sort of treed area shifting upwards in elevation, or will it not be able to do that for reasons other than temperature? So that's interesting that you found lack of regeneration at high elevations in glacier. So that's interesting.
So our next question comes from Allie. Since I noticed lots of fuel in national parks, and it seems that at some point it will burn, is there anything that is allowed to be done, such as clearing the fuel, or is that not allowed because it is a national park?
Oh, that's a good question. So I know, and Samara, maybe you would know more about this than I do. I know the park has done some prescribed burns, and particularly down in the grasslands where they can see, they can see the aspen moving in and colonizing what used to be quite open grasslands. These, of course, are on way smaller of a scale than the Kenow wildfire, which was not planned and was way bigger than any prescribed burn would ever be allowed to be. I don't know about fuel clearance, do you?
Unfortunately, that's not my specialty for sure.
Yeah.
I may be able to look into this a little bit more. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our next question, though, in the meantime. So this is from Kelly. So I may have missed this as I joined about 10 minutes after you began your presentation, but did you see any differences between sites that had experienced both prescribed fire and wildfire as compared to those which had just experienced one or the other?
Yeah, so we were interested in this because we did have some unburned sites over on the sort of Sofa Mountain side, so the eastern side of the park, which did have a fire, a smaller fire than the Kenow fire, sort of in between our surveys and the 1990 surveys, I believe. But it turned out none of the plots lined up with any of the prescribed burns or the Sofa fire. So all of our plots that were burned were only burned by the Kenow fire, unless they were burned. Of course, they could have been burned, prior to 1910, way back in the day. So we weren't able to sort of get at that question of, okay, if it's kind of like a previous question where someone was saying maybe the successional stage that the place was at before it burned would have an influence on how resilient those plants are, which I think is true. But unfortunately, we didn't have any overlap between the Kenow fire and those prescribed burns with any of our 98 plots. Good point, though.
So just a couple more questions. This one comes from Tabitha. What kind of management options does your research suggest could be considered useful?
Well, I think if Parks Canada is worried about exotic species, and I know they are, and this is not something that we didn't know before, is to concentrate near human access places, but also the combination of near roads and trails and severely burned is the place where you'd want to keep your eye out. On the other hand, reading some of the work that came out of Yellowstone after they had major fires in the 80s, they did see kind of a bloom or like a flush of exotic species, including things like Canada thistle, coming up around campground areas in the severely burned areas near human disturbance, and they got really worried about that. But then as the forest recovered, many of those exotic species actually declined again because the conditions that they needed weren't there anymore. So we don't know what's going to happen in Waterton in terms of these exotic species. And the interesting thing to me is that we're seeing, even though I find the number of exotic species and the abundance of them still quite low compared to what I'm used to in agricultural landscapes, they are expanding both in burned areas and unburned areas. And so I think it'll be a matter of choosing your battles, right? We're not going to prevent all exotic species from colonizing or spreading, but we might want to pick, for management, the ones that we have evidence could cause the most change or the most competition for native species that we might particularly care about, and focus on those.
Wonderful, thank you. So just two more here. So this one comes from Leslie. How has soil degradation impacted plant regrowth in burned areas?
Ooh, that's a great question, because walking around in there, so I was there in 2018, so just one summer after the fire, and you could see these incredible, like where the soil had burned down sort of below where the trunk of a tree meets the roots. You could actually sometimes see under the trunk because of how, like a meter of soil and humus had burned away that organic layer. And so we were very surprised. That's part of the reason why it was so surprising to have such a high proportion of plants, even in severely burned areas, showing up again that were there in the 1990s. So that's another thing that we didn't test, but that would be good to test in relation to that rate of turnover in plant species, is how does the sort of, if we measured the soil loss, does that predict? Because I would expect that the more soil you still have, the bigger seed bank, the more protection for those underground storage organs. And so you would expect greater resilience there. Yeah, so I think the impacts on the soil is a really important component that we also need to consider.
Wonderful. And last but certainly not least, a question from Dan. So change is perpetual. Of the changes you've discussed, which do you consider, oh, this is a word beyond my IQ, deleterious? And what can or should we do? Apologies, Dan.
Yeah, so this is a philosophical debate. And so for myself, so for example, when I showed you those stats where we have more species, we have more species per plot, is that a good thing? I think as a scientist, I can tell you, okay, we have more species, and I can tell you which species we have more of and which species maybe we have less of and are suffering. Which ones we care about depends a lot upon our values. So in terms of what is deleterious, from my perspective as someone new to the area, I don't know if I see anything deleterious. I mean, I see this amazing setback of everything that was burned, and this amazing opening up and favoring of these fire following, light loving. I mean, the vistas are just amazing. The trees are all dead, but the understory diversity is really high in some cases with all these light loving species. So yeah, I don't know if I would point to anything particularly as deleterious. I actually think the fire may have, the fact that the fire came in and didn't burn the whole entire park means we still have forested areas that are favoring these sort of shade loving, tending to be more woody and perennial, those types of species, at the same time as we've now opened things back up for the more sun loving species that were probably the ones that were declining the most with this lack of fire over the past 100 years. So that probably is a very unsatisfying answer, but I agree with you. Change is perpetual, and from my perspective, if we have certain rare plants and we can document that they're getting outcompeted or threatened by exotics, we may want to pinpoint those. But in terms of us having control over how, the whole area in terms of what's going on in the plants, I think that would be way too ambitious and a bit of hubris on our part.
Wonderful, and thank you to some of the wizards in the background of this presentation. In response to Ali's question, just to talk a little bit more about fuel reduction. So Parks Canada does do prescribe fire as a fuel reduction tool, but it's not a widespread practice, so it's quite limited. And also Leslie Littlehead commented in the chat as below. So a prescribed burn behind Bertha Lane in the Waterton town site did help save the town site. So there is a reduction in some of the understory and other fuel that is possible there, but it is quite a small scale thing. I hope that helps. All right, so thank you so much for attending. Thank you for the wonderful questions. Be sure to join us again tomorrow at noon for a presentation about the Waterton Glacier International Dark Sky Park. Thank you for attending today, and to our wonderful speaker, planning, and tech teams. We'll be sending out a survey after this webinar, and we love your feedback as it helps us plan future events. Have a great day. We'll be closing the session shortly. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Samara.